And this afternoon's speaker needs no introduction really at all, but she's going to get one. It is Faraday Institute's course director, Hilary Marlow. Hilary has degrees in social science and biblical studies and a PhD in theology, and an involvement with a number of organisations that are concerned with Christian concern for the environment, so Arosha and the John Ray initiative. And Hilary is, we've heard a lot so far in this course from scientists. Hilary's going to give us more theological perspective and talk to us on the Bible and biology. Hilary.
Thanks very much. This feels a little bit like poacher turned gamekeeper or something like that. So I got given the title Biology and the Bible, and perhaps the first question is, what does the Bible have to do with biology and why does it matter? And the working thesis of this talk is that the biology of the Bible has profound theological implications. And what we're going to do is think a little bit about biology and think a little bit about theology. And in the end, I hope, time permitting, we'll actually delve into a text of the Bible, and you should have a handout here to you with some sections from the book of Job. Oh, sorry.
Is that better? Okay. We should have a handout with some sections from the book of Job, and we're hoping to get to those later on. Just by way of starting point, of course we know that the Bible's not a study guide or a science textbooks. So we're not actually looking into the Bible for the kind of information that we've received in the other presentations this weekend. And it would be entirely wrong to expect it to deliver that kind of knowledge. We need to bear in mind when we think about the Bible that its authors were real people. We don't believe in the kind of Muslim tradition that the scriptures kind of came down from heaven, as it were, via an angel, but it was actually real people writing, led by the Spirit of God. And these people had an interest in their world, and that's bound to permeate their writings. We need to also remember that the world in which they are writing is the world of the ancient Near East, is a world where God or the gods are intimately involved in life, in people's lives. They are creators, they are sustainers. The earth is a creation of the gods, or in the case of the Christian Bible, the one God. And then we need to bear in mind that we come at the text, reading the Bible, from our own perspectives. We're reading an ancient text, and some bits of it always seem really strange to us because they are coming out of an ancient context. And yet we are participants in the story of God's dealings in his world. And so we have that perhaps slight tension of understanding when the text is talking in ways that will be much more understandable in its own original context, and how we then interpret that in our own. Let's think first a little bit about biology. Loosely defined, and this won't satisfy the experts here, as the study of life and living organisms. You don't have to read very far in the Old Testament to find that it is full of references to life and living organisms. Often those are references in passing, but nonetheless they are quite significant. And of course it perhaps goes without saying that the Bible, when it talks about living organisms and systems, is concerned with observable species. It's concerned with the animals, the plants and so on that people encounter in their daily lives, positively or negatively. It's an interest in animal terms, in behaviour rather than anatomy or physiology, with a few exceptions. And in this respect, it contrasts very much to the writings of, say, Aristotle in the 5th century. His history of animals goes into an incredible amount of detail, explaining, as he understood it, the system whereby different animals operated. Some inhale and exhale air, others don't do so but live on dry land. Insects have notches on their bodies, whatever that means. And so this is a whole work that goes on in that vein. So there are other writers in that period that are doing detailed natural history guides, and the Bible isn't like that. And it obviously goes without saying that in the world of the Bible, what we get is zoology and ecology rather than microbiology or cell biology or anything like that, because the level of understanding is only operating at that level. So, how is the Bible's interest in biology demonstrated? Let's look at a couple of examples. In the ancient Near East, there are lots of examples of what's called onomastica, which is literature that catalogues various things. This is an Egyptian document written on papyrus about 1800 years BC, and it's a list of different kinds of thing. This is actually one of the oldest literary forms that we know. It's a list of terms and names, often with a common denominator that's noted in the introduction. In this particular one, I think there are lists of types of cities, types of buildings, types of people groups, types of agriculture and crops and so on. There's a great debate as to why this concern with lists. Some people have suggested it was just educational. You get school kids to copy them out so they learn the alphabet and so on. But actually a list conveys a really big amount of information with real brevity. And it can be a way of kind of establishing control, getting things into a manageable kind of framework. Actually, I'm going to tell a little story which may embarrass her a bit, but when we interviewed Cara by Skype for her present job, we were concerned to get someone who was pretty organised, and one of the things we asked all the candidates was about how they managed kind of organising events and so on. And Cara's response was, lists, I love lists. Yeah. And I know that at that point, Ruth and I decided this is probably the person for us. And actually, as you can see, those of you that have encountered her efficiency, the speakers and the being filmed and so on, she certainly lived up to that promise. So lists can be important to establish control, to establish governance. There are some lists, and we'll come to those in a moment, but thinking about the Bible now, I want to think first of all about the level of knowledge. And the text that you might be aware of is this reference to Solomon's wisdom that includes his knowledge of animals and trees and so on, and his understanding that he was happy to speak about, he wanted to communicate. Another way in which the Bible classifies things is by dividing them into broad categories. And so if you read Genesis, we have this phrase of every kind, or according to its kind, which suggests that the author's really concerned to separate things out into various categories. And they had this kind of simple classification system, breaking species down into 3 different or 4 different categories. So here's an example from Genesis. Fish of the sea, birds of the air, and every living thing that moves on the earth. So you've got sea, air, and earth. Sometimes it expands to 4. Here we've got the addition of things that creep on the ground as well as animals. So that distinction between animals and creeping things crops up somewhere. Another example, here we've got cattle, birds of the air, and animals. Animals of the field are probably wild animals. It depends. So the distinction there between domestic and wild animal coming in. Another example, this is another 4-1. We've got domestic animals, wild animals, fish, and birds. And those kind of lists occur all the time. If your eyes are attuned, you'll come across them if you read the Bible quite often. So that's a sort of a broad categorization. Moving down into a little bit more classification, the example par excellence of that is in the book of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, the lists of clean and unclean animals. And I've only just put a little section up here to illustrate that. We've got animals with divided hoofs and grass eating that you are allowed to eat if you're an Israelite, but those that have one or the other, you're not. So, for example, the rock badger eats grass but it doesn't have divided hoofs, therefore they may not eat it. The pig has divided hoofs and does not eat the grass, therefore they may not eat it. And so also with birds and with insects. There's a lot of speculation as to why those categorizations occur. Why, for example, are certain birds unclean and certain not? Some of the categorization may be to do with the eating habits of those birds. For example, in the list there, eagle, vulture, osprey, buzzard, kite, they all are carnivores and or scavengers, so they eat other flesh. And the whole Hebrew notion of the blood, the life being in the blood, perhaps preventing Israelites from eating an animal that had itself fed on carrion. There are other birds not in this reference that are also prohibited, like herons and storks. And the thought there is that perhaps that's because they probe for their food in the ground, or they thought that they probed for their food. Herons don't, but that they were in the mud, and that also was regarded as unclean. So there's all sorts of speculation about why this particular categorization of animals. But it seems to me that it's a hint towards a very early sense of wanting to establish some kind of taxonomy, some kind of a way of dividing up the species. It's a very different one from the sort of Linnaean system, but it's actually wanting to put species into different boxes according to certain characteristics, and is really interesting. Okay, another issue I want to come on, and I'm talking here as my subject of expertise, just as you have biologists of different shapes and forms, is Hebrew Bible and Hebrew and so on. So I want to just talk about some of the issues that we wrestle with that actually get me out of bed in the morning. You may fall asleep, but they get me out of bed in the morning. And this is one of those, is the problem with translation. So if you think about it, the only literature we have with Hebrew in it is the Hebrew scriptures. It's not like the Greek world where there's a huge amount of literature in Greek that you can compare and you can see vocabulary trends and so on. We just have the Hebrew of the Hebrew Bible. So when you come across a word that is only once used in the whole of the Bible, you have immediately a translation issue. What is its equivalent in English? And a number of the animals and bird names that crop up are in that category. They only crop up once or twice. So in Hebrew, you might start to uncode those by looking at the root from which that word came. And Hebrew is very systematic. All words derive from 3 root letters, and sometimes by extrapolation, a noun derives from a particular verb meaning, and you can get the meaning like that. What I often find, and this is the geek in me, the Hebrew language geek, is that you find incredible inconsistency in Bible translations. And I'm just going to show you a couple and explain why they're problematic. So this is a verse from Isaiah, and it's talking about a desolate building. It's describing a desolate situation. The ruined buildings are going to be possessed by the hawk and the hedgehog, my translation says, and the owl and the raven. So this is a picture of desolation. And the Hebrew word for kippod the Hebrew word that's translated hedgehog is kippod. It only occurs a couple of times in the Bible. Its root letters mean something like rolling up, or curling up small, or possibly being on the ground. So possibly you can see why this translator has chosen hedgehog, may well right. But if you look at the same word in Zephaniah chapter 2, it says, the desert owl and the screech owl, kippod, shall lodge on its capitals. It's talking about a ruined building again, but it's talking about the capitals, the pillars. The owl shall hoot at the window, the raven croak on the threshold. Same kind of idea, but the problem with Zephaniah is you've got whatever species it is up on the pillars at the top of the building. And biology probably tells you that hedgehogs don't normally inhabit that sort of scenario, but owls do. And that's, from my point of view, owl, some species of owl, is much more likely as a translation of kippod. And I don't know why the translator has not recognised that discrepancy. There's some people have suggested that actually kippod, the idea of sort of curling up small, might be referring to a ground nesting bird, and there are some species of owl, I believe, that nest, if not on the ground, but quite low down. So, you know, you can see how perhaps the author is trying to get at something, but the translator, I think, has missed a trick. Let me give you another example. And this is actually the same verse, coincidentally, seeing as you're familiar with this verse, and it's the second half of it. The word for owl, translated owl there, yan suf, or yan suf. Again, doesn't crop up very often in the Hebrew. As As you probably know, the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek, and then from the Greek was made a Latin translation by Jerome. The Greek translation probably happened of the book of Isaiah perhaps in the 2nd century BC, so it happened before the Vulgate. In the Greek and the Vulgate translation, it's rendered as ibis. And why would that be? Well, the probability is that the Greek translator didn't know what Yansuf was. He didn't come across this word, so he chose a word that he thought might fit, and maybe he was trying to make some particular point. Some people suggest it's because the ibis is a sacred bird in Egypt. He was trying to sort of elevate the text a little bit. Sometimes clues to translation meanings can come from the modern Hebrew, albeit by a somewhat staccato route. So in modern Hebrew, yansuf is the Hebrew word for Asiophlaneus, the short-eared owl, which kind of fits the Hebrew but doesn't fit the Greek, obviously. Trying to work from the modern Hebrew back to ancient Hebrew is helpful but not 100% certain, because there has been a gap, obviously quite a long gap, between when ancient Hebrew was used as a language and when modern Hebrew was conceptualized and introduced in the 19th century. But some of the bird names, I think, actually make sense when you look back at them. Interestingly, also sticking on this, the second half of this verse, where you have the owl and the raven shall live in it, the King James Version has the cormorant and the bittern. I don't know, don't ask me, but yes, there are all sorts of issues. And if you have, I have a real passionate interest in how the Old Testament depicts the natural world, and those kind of details really matter. I want the species to be correct. And I'll also tell you that in my sort of spare time, what I do for a hobby is bird watching. So the bird names particularly are really important, because I love identifying birds, and it matters to me that actually you know whether you're looking at a spotted redshank or a redshank or a, a curlew or a whimbrel or whatever. So this is really important. Okay, another aspect of the Old Testament that we might want to think about is the way that it uses the imagery of nature. And actually, if you read the Bible, it is absolutely full of figurative language surrounding nature. And it's such a rich source, obviously, the natural world, for metaphor, imagery, and so on. And why is that? Well, you use what you know, of course. You use your sort of metaphorical language is out of your experience. You use what you observe that is relevant. Let me give you an example of how something that is very prevalent in the Bible and would have been grown very much in the ancient world in Israel, not in Mesopotamia or Egypt, the grapevine. So climate and topography in Israel is ideally suited to the vine, unlike the floodplain of Egypt or the floodplains of Mesopotamia, which have much greater salinity and so on. So Israel's much more suited. Perhaps that's why in the book of Isaiah, something like the book of Isaiah, you have so many references to vines and vineyards, metaphorically likening the people to a vine that has been planted in the land and is now not yielding grapes and so on. This is a vine in winter. You can see how the prophet might use it as an analogy for the people kind of being dead and having come to nothing. His disheartenment about the way the people have behaving. God looked for much from them, but they delivered nothing, says Isaiah chapter 5. And this is a vine in winter. It doesn't look much. It's got this deadness about it. And then there are other verses that talk about vines flourishing and bringing forth fruit and leaf and so on. And you've only got to look at the transformation that happens in the summer, the autumn in this case, to a vine and realise that there's a real rich spiritual metaphor. Of course, that metaphor is one that is carried over into the New Testament, famously in John chapter 14. Vineyard imagery. It's what's around them, it's what they see, but it also has this kind of very evocative quality about it. There are far more references to vineyards, metaphorically, in the prophets than there are to the other two major crops that would have been commonplace, olives and figs. So I think the vineyard imagery is something that is particularly appropriate to describing the relationship of the people with God, which is a bit of a checkered relationship, you could say, at best. Let me just throw out another example of figurative language, and that is verses like this. They're talking about nature praising God, but this is inanimate nature. This is trees singing. This is trees clapping their hands, mountains bursting into song. And if you look in commentaries, they by and large talk about this being kind of mere metaphor, just figurative imagery. That may be the case, but I also suspect that the ancient people didn't have this same clear categorization that we have between what is metaphor and what is reality. And I have this sense that although very clearly in the Old Testament there is never any attempt to worship nature or to divinize it, in fact the opposite is the case in many, many places, including Genesis 1. The whole thrust is the de-divinization of nature. Yet you get that sense in verses like this, that the people saw that the natural world was kind of with them on a journey of praise of God, rather than just something that sat there and watched the people praising. So that's something we'll come back to a little bit in a moment. Some people call it mere personification, merely personification. I don't like that term merely. It seems to actually undermine something. Another aspect that we might want to think about is that the way that the Old Testament portrays the ecology, and of course we're perhaps used as Christians to reading the Bible as the story of a history between the people of God and God himself and their journey. I think that's a wrong place to start. I think we need to start with the Bible, reading it as a story of God and his dealings with the world, the whole world, not just with people. And as you do that, you realise how much there is in the Old Testament about geography, about landscape, about topography, about the terrains that operate. We haven't actually got time to go in it, but this is a fascinating book by Dr Hilary, The Natural History of the Bible. Dr Hilary is an ecologist who is Jewish, and he actually was born in Palestine before the creation of the state of Israel in the 1940s, and he grew up roaming around the kind of the biblical landscape, if you like. And he's now, at the end of his life, written this book reflecting back on his Jewish heritage, which is the story of the people of God, but within their ecological context. And he actually identifies 5 or 6 different ecological domains in which the story unfolds, and a wonderful blending of the story of the text and the ecology of the land. We haven't got time to look in it, but it talks about highlands that are well watered, the semi-arid pasture lands, the river valleys, the floodplains, the coastal plain, and then finally the desert. And he explores this in a very rich way. Another way that we might think about the Old Testament and how it depicts its world is using the metaphor or the language of interconnection. We've already heard from Margaret about the sort of rich interconnection that there is in a coral reef between species. And we're aware of, if you like, the ecological language whereby we are part of the web of life. I'd say that in the Old Testament, in the Bible, there is a three-way interconnection, a kind of web of life that plays out, whereby you have God interacting with his world, the natural world, and with humanity. And that three-way interconnection, God and people, God and the natural world, people and the natural world, is a interrelationship that plays out throughout the text. It often plays out for ill rather than for good, and there's lots of examples of fractured relationships along those axes, but also sometimes of positive ones. We can think a little bit about those in a moment. The thing that is different about the biblical worldview and this sort of web of interconnection compared with contemporary ecological understandings, the science of ecology, of course, is this is a theocentric worldview. This has God right at the heart, right at the top. Everything else unfolds under the governance of God. And of course, that's a very unique perspective compared with modern scientific ones. Okay, that's a little bit about biology. I want to very quickly talk about what the Bible tells us about God in relation to his creation, and think about how the natural world feeds into our understanding of God and of the world. So, I'm going to rush through this quite quickly. Firstly, God reveals himself through the natural world. And I should say this PowerPoint will be available for you to have afterwards, so don't feel you have to get everything down. He even reveals himself through a donkey in Numbers chapter 22. Creation, the natural world reflects God's glory. Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. The natural world is called to praise God. We saw that already in the passages we had up just now. Psalm 148 is a wonderful sort of call to praise that includes animate and inanimate nature in its call, along with people, rich and poor. It seems to encompass the whole. Everything from rocks through to the king, if you like, is called to praise God. The natural world has intrinsic value, which means that there's quite a lot of examples. Although in the Bible the natural world is there for human beings to use, it's their source of life, they grow crops, they live off it, they hunt, they guard their flocks against predators and so on. There's enough to suggest also a strong view that the natural world has a validity all of itself other than its usefulness to human beings. This is a real issue in biology, in ecology actually, and this is something that is really debated in conservation biology. Does wild nature have a value other than its value for human populations? And that's a key issue. And of course, once you ascribe intrinsic value to wild nature, if you don't have a faith system that has a God that gives it value, you're left with a sort of, well, why would you think it has any intrinsic value? If you have a sort of Dawkinian naturalistic view, then why would there be any intrinsic value? It just is. So it seems that Christian theology offers an answer to whether nature has intrinsic value. A lot of conservation biologists want to believe that it does, and do believe that it does, but I'm not sure they have a good reason for doing so. So Christian theology can help there. A few other points. Animals are held up as an example. The one I like is in Jeremiah 8, which is about the stork and the crane knowing the time of migration. They know when they should leave, but people don't know how to obey God. And it's kind of drawing this analogy. Animals know how to behave, you don't. The natural world features quite a bit in the life and death of Jesus. Think about the birth narrative. You have a spectacular astronomical event that brings the Magi to Bethlehem. You have nature, creation at work. The stars that the psalmists look at are doing something. In the temptation in Mark's Gospel, it talks about Jesus being with the animals. Just like that. Doesn't say what they were doing together, but they were there together. The miracles of Jesus, transforming nature. The death of Jesus in Matthew's Gospel, you have an earthquake taking place and disruption. So when Jesus is there is disruption going on in the natural world, which is very much paralleled by some of the disruption in the Old Testament when God is on the move, to use the C.S. Lewis Aslan quote. The natural world laments over human sin and rises up in judgment against injustice. And then, as we've heard, there's an eschatological vision for biology, for the natural world. A little bit about our own role within that. We're fearfully and wonderfully made, says the psalmist. We're part of a good ecological system. When God comments on the world that he has created in Genesis 1, it says, God saw all that he had made and it was very good. It's not that he saw human beings and thought, creme de la creme. He saw the whole of things. He saw the ecosystem, if you like, and saw that that was good. We're made in the image of God. That's a tricky one to unpack. People have debated that for 2,000 years. We may not have time to get onto that. We're also servants of the natural world and called, as Margaret was saying, to care for it. Now, I've rattled through that, and partly I've done so deliberately because I have written about that in a little book that I have here. I know the bookstall is closed, but I took the liberty of extrapolating a few copies of that from the bookstall before it shut. So if you feel that you want to go into this in more detail, then do come up and see me afterwards. Okay, I want to move on in the last part of this talk to think about bits of the book of Job. And you've got the handout. We're going to look at that in a little bit more detail. It's an example, I think, the book of Job, of biology and theology brought together. Of course, the context, and we're not going to deal with that now, is one of the most profound questions of all time. And it's a question that isn't answered in Job, and not really satisfactorily by anybody else ever since. You know, the question of why do bad things happen to good people? That's Job's complaint, and he doesn't ever get an answer. But the climax, if you like, of the book is this speech by God where he kind of parades his handiwork in front of Job and asks him to consider it. And in Job chapter 39, which is on your handout, we get this range of a variety of species characterized by birth, life and freedom. And as Robert Galbraith says, with a vividness born of deep love and careful observation, the poet pictures the beasts, remote from human beings, yet precious to their maker. And the sense in Job 39 is an emphasis on wildness. These are animals that cannot be domesticated or contained. There's a lot of discussion amongst scholars as to why this particular group of animals, and there's no real answer. The main sense is that these are animals that are outside of human sphere. These are not domestic animals. It does talk later in the passage about the war horse, but even then, in the ancient world, in the Hebrew world, horses were not kind of domesticated in the sense that they are today. They were used only in battle, and therefore quite wild and deliberately so. And Gordis goes on to say, the implication is clear. The universe and its creator cannot be judged solely from the vantage point of man, and surely not from the limited perspective of one human being. I just want to highlight from this chapter 39, a few points that you might notice if you look through in some detail. There's a real knowledge of the biology there. The biology of the time, it might not be accurate, so please don't come back at me and say, oh, well, they don't do that. Actually, we know that this species doesn't do that. But if you look down at verses 1 and 2, talking about the life cycle of a particular species, the ibex, gestation and birth. Then if you look down to as far as verses 5 to 8, we've got a series of descriptions of habitats, steppe, saltlands, the mountains, the place where the wild ass or the onager lives. And then we've got observations about behaviour. So, for example, the flightlessness of the ostrich in verses 13 and 18. The fact that they're ground nesting. Incidentally, I read that 90% of ostrich nests are destroyed by predators. I don't know if that's accurate or not, I read it somewhere. But in the Hebrew texts, there's an indication that perhaps it neglects its eggs. And scholars have debated that and wondered why that is so, because that is not the behaviour of ostriches in the wild as we know it. And the suggestion is that actually ostrich eggs are laid communally. In other words, an ostrich lays its eggs in a depression in the ground, and then another hen comes and lays her egg, and another one. And what happens is that one hen will probably often incubate several eggs belonging to other hens. But then when the first chick hatches, the hen that's been incubating is the layer of the first egg, will then tend to that one and appear to neglect the rest of the nest. Hence, perhaps, the indication in Job that the ostrich neglects its own young. Then, moving on in, where is it? Verses 26 onwards, it's talking about the hawk. And in your translation, verse 27, it said talks about the eagle. I want to change that to be the vulture. This is a griffin vulture, actually picture taken in Israel. The root that is used there in the Hebrew is nesher, which means to lacerate. So you can kind of see where a large raptor would come out of that sort of understanding. But interestingly, if you look down at verse 29, it talks about from there it spies the prey, its eyes see it from far away. And a characteristic of particularly the griffin vulture is its eyesight, and that it hunts by eye and not by smell or sound or any other way. And actually, if you've ever been in a context where there are vultures around, you'll know it doesn't take very long when you have a carcass before the vultures are circling. In fact, they often circle before the animal has died. And then, going back to verse 9, the wild ox. I haven't got a live picture of that because this is probably the auroch, which is now extinct. But the point about it is, although it's the wild antecedent of domestic cattle, it was known for its wildness and its inability to be harnessed. So that's a biological focus from these verses, and I've rushed through. You'll have to read them again and look out for the biology. What's the theological focus? Well, there isn't a huge amount, actually, except, and I think this is really significant, is that this is God's wisdom at work. And in verse 26, God's rhetorical question to Job, is it by your wisdom that the hawk soars? Invites the answer, no, actually, it is by my wisdom, by God's wisdom, that these things happen. And similarly, in verse 17, God perhaps withholds wisdom in the poet's mind from the ostrich. It's not quite as intelligent as it might be suggesting. And actually, if you've seen some birds at work, you realise that they aren't always quite as intelligent as we sometimes give them credit for, with the exception perhaps of corvids. Interestingly, there's no sense in these texts that the creatures praise God at all. They're just doing their stuff. They're doing what their biology, their ecology tells them to do. And I suspect that lack of any explicit reference to praise is because actually that is what their praise is. I'll come to that in a minute. So that actually to live as an animal is actually to praise God and to live within your ecosystem, within your habitat, doing the stuff that you do is praise of God. I do want to just touch on chapter 40 over the page. Behemoth and Leviathan. Yes, except that I very much would like to say that Behemoth, which is just literally the Hebrew word for a big animal, is a hippopotamus. Now, before you say no hippopotamuses in Israel, there were hippopotami in Israel, and I can't remember when the last one was there, but they found hippopotamus bones in Israel. It was much less, I mean, you think of it now, if you've been, as a very arid, dry country. It was much more sort of wooded and watered and so on in the past. So there is a lot of debate whether this Behemoth and the Leviathan in chapter 41 are real creatures or mythical creatures. Gordis, who I've already referred to, thinks they're real. I read another book by someone else who refuted every point that Gordis made. My instinct is twofold. My instinct is, first of all, this is a catalogue of known observable species. This is in the context of known and observable species. So we have to have a very strong indication that we should move outside of that world to something mythological. So that's why I put the picture of the hippo there. Behemoth, hippopotamus. My second instinct is to say that actually we draw this great, huge separation between real and mythological. And I'm not convinced that the ancient Hebrews had quite that strong sense of separation. If you think back to those texts we had up about the owl on the ruined building, if you imagine that you are an ancient Israelite and you visit, for some reason you're caught out after dark. I don't suppose you did go out after dark because you don't have street lights and you don't have, the way to light, you don't have a sort of torch on your smartphone or whatever. You're caught out after dark and you stray to some ruins and you're just kind of scurrying home and you hear an owl hoot. What do? You jump out of your skin. And if your mama has told you, don't be out late because the bogies will get you, you're absolutely terrified, you scurry home. So you can see how mythological and real kind of blend together in an ancient context. And our rationalistic mind separates them. I think that the ancients there's a little bit of overlap there. Still, having said that, I think this is talking about a real animal. So if we look at some of the characteristics, we've got description of its physical characteristics in verses 16 to 18. It's got muscles, its size, its strength. We've got descriptions of its food in verse 15. It's a herbivore, yet it's untamed. We've got descriptions of habitat in verses 21 to 22. Under the lotus plants, it's a water dweller. It hides in reeds and marshes. And we've got descriptions of its behaviour. It's not put out, afraid, it's confident, it's strong. It's not something that can be tamed. My husband and I went on a trip to Kenya to visit our son several years ago, and we actually went and stayed on a little lodge on a lake and got taken in a sort of single-engine little speedboat to see the hippos. And the guide took us and our two daughters up towards this wallowing flock, or whatever they're called, group of hippos on the lake edge. And you could see that the guide was tense in a positive way because he took us so far. We took pictures and then just as quickly he put the boat into reverse and took us out of there. Because you probably know that hippopotamuses are the most dangerous land animal in the world. They do more damage, they are ferociously bad-tempered and fierce and so on. And so you don't want to mess with a hippopotamus. I see no reason to suspect they were any different then, so hence the description of their strength and so on. But Job doesn't make any attempt to sort of say, these are terrible things. It's actually, the poet, it's actually a poem of praise towards them. It's a poem of their beauty. in God's eyes, even though their strength is such that nobody can tame them. But just notice as I come to an end in this verse, although there's a little bit of God focus, theological focus here. In verse 15, look at Behemoth, look at the hippopotamus, which I made just as I made you. So the hippopotamus is a creature, it's not a mythological divine being, it's a creature, it's not a god, it's something that is made by God, just as humans are made by God, putting humans and the rest of the natural world on a sort of level plane as creatures, one with another. But interesting further, it says a little bit more in verse 19. This hippopotamus is the first of the great acts of God. Only its maker can approach it. You know, we tend to perhaps think of human beings as the greatest and the first of God's great acts. But actually it's holding up the hippopotamus here. And is that because of its might? Is that because of its strength? Is that because it's viewed as the creature that nothing else can sort of trump in terms of size and strength? Well, we don't know. The might of God is contrasted with it. Only God is mightier than the hippopotamus. And if we go back to verse 4, we find that all of this comparison and this sort of trotting out of the natural world, this kind of David Attenborough kind of documentary of this poet, renders Job utterly speechless. He says, I am of small account, what shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. And the richness and the diversity of the natural world renders Job speechless. And I've got one last slide. I kind of felt that in a biology conference, I really did have to have some sort of biology slides up there. So, first of all, I got a reference, a quote here from a book by William Brown called The Ethos of the Cosmos, which is really great. And he's suggesting that the essential feature to human life, an essential feature, is being confronted with living beings that live and function in ways so different that they stagger us. In some ways, in our world that has a lot of access by television to understanding the natural world, we're perhaps not so surprised. You know, it's easy to lose that sense of wow, awe. In a way, I pray that we never do, because I think we always need to keep being reminded that this is an awesome, awesome world, and that we need to be staggered by it. And it's, at the end it says, divine pride of workmanship is what pervades the liturgy. This is God exploring and expanding on his creation. And as I say, my last animal slide takes us into chapter 41, which we haven't got time to look at. But the crocodile is a suggested translation for the Leviathan, possibly the whale. People debate it. If you read Psalm 104, it talks about God creating the sea and the ships, and Leviathan to frolic in the sea. There you might think it's referring to the whale. The description here fits much more closely with the sort of physiology and appearance of a crocodile or some such animal. This description doesn't answer Job's conundrum. It doesn't explain away the problem. And as I've said, I don't think it's very hard to explain the problem. And I think Alistair's comments about leaving some questions unanswered, and as you get older not knowing, having glib answers, is a very wise one, because I think it's very hard. We need to wrestle with them, but to come up with definitive answers is difficult. And I just want to close with a quote from the William Brown book, which I think encapsulates it nicely. He says this: in addition to reforming Job's own character, creation, that is the natural world, reveals the contours of authentic community, whose diverse members exercise inalienable freedoms, most particularly the freedoms from control. Each has its appropriate domain within the larger landscape, and yet they traverse freely. Furthermore, a measure of interdependence is operative. The lion and raven must feed off prey to survive, so also the vultures who clean up the battlefield. Predation is present, but does not ultimately define the contours of this wild community. Rather, freedom, vitality, fearlessness, and most of all, wondrous difference define it. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Harry. We've got some time for questions. Who's want to kick off?
Well, if nobody else has a question, it was really more a commenting around about your concept of lists. And lists are very, very prevalent in ordinary speech, particularly three-part lists, which serve a particular function because they've got a beginning, middle, and then they're completing themselves. So they tell a story, they make a point, and conclusion. So you can see a three-part list, as I say, very common. They'll be doing something. But if you see a list which isn't, which is what this is, it's not doing anything. It's completely open-ended. It is just a list. And so in a sense, I get a strong sense that what we're saying here is there is abundance here. Here's an example, here's an example. Go on, go on, go on. We're not going to come to an end. We're not going to make a point. We're not going to do anything with this. We're just going to let you wallow in this open-ended kind of experience. And that's what I would get from a discursive point of view, from a list such as this.
Yes, I mean, I didn't even think of this as being a list in a way, because as you say, it's just a series of examples of what's out there. And if you read chapter 38, there's a whole other long series of examples in sort of the inanimate world, and then the lion and the raven and so on. So it's almost just tumbling over itself to explain or to explore rather. I mean, what's interesting about the speech in Job 38 through to 41 is that it kind of follows the contours of the Genesis creation account, in that it starts with sort of cosmological interests about the heavens and the earth, the separation of water, and it moves into talking about the inanimate earth, if you like, rocks and mountains and weather and things like that. But then by far and away the most of it, from halfway through chapter 38, all through 31, 39, 40 and 41, is about the animal kingdom. And it's like some of the sort of the one-liners that you get in Genesis chapter 1, it's like a sort of exponential expansion of that the poet is looking at. And it's like he's sort of seen we've got the natural world, and let's explore what it is and expand out. And I think there's any number of species that could have come in there. I don't think I think the list is perhaps chosen because they are all wild, and therefore they're not something that Job could...
But they needn't be making a point, that's the point. We don't
Yeah.
have to look for the point.
The point.
This work.
Yeah,
We can just
revel in it, yeah, that's true.
The Job passage says a lot about the wonder of the animals we describe. Does it say anything about the worth of them?
I think it's implicit there in bits like the verse we read, look at the hippopotamus, which I made just as I made you. So by inference, if you have any worth as a creature of God, if your worth in any sense comes from the fact that God is the one who made you, then by definition also the hippopotamus or whatever does have worth. We didn't read it, but going back into chapter 38, there's a verse that I think does speak very directly about intrinsic worth, not of species, but of just the world, the creation. It talks about God sending rain on the desert where no one lives, on the wilderness which is empty of life. And the point seems to be there that actually God is sort of challenging Job, saying, you know, everything I do, I don't just do for you. I do it because it's my creation and it has value. And that value is not dependent on whether you are present in it or not. In other words, I could do without you, essentially, but I choose not to. But the value of life is there independent of whether there is a human there or not. Which I think feeds very well into kind of some of the debates in ecology about whether we should, how much account we should take of a particular ecosystem's value in terms of human resources. And in fact, if you don't know, the science, the sort of field of ecosystem service valuation is a massive field of inquiry in conservation biology, whereby you ascribe monetary and social and cultural value to different ecosystems, and you essentially are trying to do trade-offs. And how, is it more valuable to conserve this bit of particular rare habitat with a few endangered species in it, or to allow it to be developed to provide food for X number of humans or housing or whatever? And it was true when they first started doing ecosystem service valuation that it was purely done on economics, on metrics, and it was on the yield per square metre of land or water or whatever, and the valuation went like that. Over the years, over the last sort of, I suppose 5, maybe 10 years, there's been a greater awareness that land might have, or natural worlds might have, aesthetic value. That's the closest it's got to any sort of religious language. But there might be value beyond the economic for people, and particularly often it's thinking in terms of indigenous people groups where land is sacred and there is sort of ritual associated with it. But that's it's a very utilitarian framework and mindset that I think needs to be challenged. And actually, if you talk to individual conservation biologists, they challenge it all the time, because you'll get people, and there are loads of conservation organisations have their headquarters in Cambridge, but their field workers are all over the world researching stuff, and you'll get people who are, it's the Borneo rainforest, kind of researching some rare species of plant or animal that's never going to see the light of day, has no known usefulness to human beings, no known value, I use that word in inverted commas, other than it's got this wow factor to this biologist who likes studying amphibians or whatever. And so in biologists, individual biologists, you find this intrinsic, I'm looking over at Margaret to see if she finds this in her world, this intrinsic sense of, actually this is special because it's special, we can't give a reason for that. Mm-hmm. And yet the rhetoric of the sort of politics and economics is kind of natural capital. So we use the language of economics and reduce it all to a monetary framework. The two sit very uneasily together. That was a really long answer, but thank you for giving me the opportunity to say that. I've got it off my chest now.
I wonder if the change from use of the word ecology to ecosystem services had more to do with politics and economics rather than actually the worth of the subject itself.
Mm.
Should I wait for the microphone? I have 2 questions, Hilary. Thank you for the presentation. First, what would you make of the following verses in Job 41 about the Leviathan in regards to spitting flames and all that, which is usually what is made to say that it's a mythical creature? And it's different than the behemoth because there's not the same supernatural weird things right after the behemoth. And the second question is about conservation again. Back in my biology days, I remember that one of the arguments that I've heard from conservation biology classes in terms of we don't need that's how the speech goes, right? We don't need a theistic argument in terms of care for the creation, In fact, we shouldn't need, that's what they said, because of that story that the Christian way, Judeo-Christian way of dominating was actually responsible for the big tragedy. So it's in fact that famous criticism, secular criticism to the Christians are responsible for actually trashing nature. So they would go away from that, saying that we need to conserve and preserve and take measure because of the intrinsic value of successfully evolved species. That's the argument that was very common back in Brazil in conservation biology. So if all the species are as successful in evolution as we are, that gives them intrinsic value. I don't know if you heard about that, and how would you respond to that?
Okay, let me tackle the first question first because it's the shorter and easier one. Yes, it's true that partway through the description of the crocodile in chapter 41, it does talk about it breathing fire. And I think that is one short section where the poet gets caught up in hyperbole, and poets are, not always sticking to the factual side of things. I think he gets caught up in hyperbole, and I would interpret that chapter or that bit in the light of the rest of it, which seems to be describing an aggressive animal that inhabits the waters. So, having said that, there is a strong strand of mythology in the ancient world about a sea dragon that has to be conquered. I think that there may be a sort of an undertone. It's maybe a two-way kind of, it's got two meanings for the people that know. On the one hand, this is an animal, and an animal that could do some real damage, not one to mess with. But in the ancient world also, there is this strong mythology that there is a sea dragon or a sea monster that needs to be conquered, and the gods fight against it. And sometimes the god of the sea is the sea monster that has to be curtailed and so on. And other mythology, there's lots of stories about that. The Bible is very concerned to demythologize that. And so this reference to the breathing fire may be an attempt to do so, to say, all this mythological stuff that you've heard of, actually that's not right, because actually there isn't a divine monster that is the dragon. This is not what's being talked about. This is actually a creature of God. So in other words, it's saying what you people think of as a monster is actually a creature, and this is it. That's interesting. Incidentally, the same thing is true in Genesis chapter 1. I don't know if you remember when the sea is populated with fish, it says God created the great sea monster. And that is a deliberate attempt to subvert this narrative that you have a fight between the God of the land and the God of the sea. It's actually saying, no, this God, our God, is the creator of all. And the sea monster, the great sea monster that you're afraid of because he's a god, is not a god at all. So, and there's other instances of demythologizing in Genesis 1, which I'll come back to if you want to later. Going through to the narrative that the Judeo-Christian tradition is responsible for ecological devastation. This goes back to a very formative article in the 1960s by somebody called Lynn White Jr. And he argued this. He's a historian of science, and he's arguing that it was the sort of technological development back as far as the Middle Ages and through on in the monastic period and so on that laid the foundation for the commodification of nature and its exploitation. And then he goes on to say that in the post-Enlightenment period, in the mechanistic worldview that came with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, the kind of Christian framework sort of fed that and exacerbated a view of nature that was essentially instrumental. I think he's wrong on a number of counts. I think that view is wrong on a number of counts. I think it had its benefits as well, because the whole field of eco-theology was birthed out of responses to Lynn White's thesis. So unfortunately his thesis has stayed within the world of conservation biology, where it's not really got any traction anymore in the sort of Christian world. But you still find it popping up actually at various points in amongst conservation biologists. I think it's a really very simplistic reading of the world, because the things that have changed our environment have been technological and industrial advances. That's been the big driver. And if you look at all the graphs on climate change, on global warming and CO2 emissions, the temperatures start to change at the point of the sort of 19th century going into the 20th century. And that point of industrialization, when you start to have coal-fed industry, is what makes the change. Can you lay the blame for that at the Christian tradition? I don't think you can. I think it's part of the sort of rise of modern science, and to simplistically say that's Christian is, I mean, there are some senses in which there's Christian influence in modern science, but I don't think that it's exclusively to be laid at the feet of the Christian tradition. I have to say that I don't think sometimes the Christian tradition has helped, because I think the Protestant and the Western Christian tradition has had quite a sort of instrumental view of the world. And you think of the great Victorian explorers, many of whom were strong Christians that were out there just wanting to gather as much as they can and put it in museums. And you know, it was perhaps a wrong understanding that the world was theirs because God had made it and given it to human beings. I do think that Genesis 1 has been subject to some real misunderstanding that we have legitimizes us to do what we like with nature. I don't think that's a correct reading of the text. I don't know if that answers it in part at least.
Thanks, Andrew.
Two questions. As we have dealt now with the Leviathan, I would like to know your opinion on the behemoth as well, because I learned in my Hebrew class that it can't be the hippopotamus, because the tail is mentioned as stiff like a cedar, which is usually not the case for a hippopotamus, and that it nourishes itself in the mountains, where you hardly find hippopotami, at least not the ones we know today. So what do you make of these two characteristics? And the other thing is, if you think about ecosystems, it's very interesting in Genesis 1 that the predators are left out in Genesis 1. Animals don't seem to feed on flesh. So what do you make of that?
Okay, thank you. I will be the first to say that I haven't studied hippopotamus physiology or ecology in any depth, and I haven't had time to go into that in preparation for this. My sense is that if the ancient Hebrew observer made a mistake, then we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, to use an English expression. I think that, I mean, one of the other options for the behemoth is being a water buffalo. As far as I know, they don't hold their tails stiffly. Someone can correct me if they know either. I don't know quite what that verse means. I haven't looked that verse up in the Hebrew. Did you read it in Hebrew? Because I know that a lot of the rest of Job is fiendishly difficult to translate. For example, what did
I just report what my professor
Okay,
said.
okay,
Yeah,
yeah,
it's not
okay.
hippopotamus.
My creationist acquaintances try and persuade me it's a dinosaur.
For example, let me give you an example of the difficulty of the Hebrew in Job. If you look at chapter 39, verse 13, which on your handout says, "The ostrich's wings flap wildly, though its pinions lack plumage." Nobody knows what that means. And in fact, a different translation by a well-known Hebrew scholar, "The wings of the ostrich are beautiful, but are they the pinions of the hawk or falcon?" is an equally valid translation of that verse. And it's not a case of that's a far-fetched one. They could equally well be true, because the Hebrew words used are so rare. Most of them are what we call hapexagomena, which means something that only occurs once. So that may be true of the tail. The mountain one, it just says the mountains yield food for it. It isn't really specific that it's actually found in the mountains. I know that there have been hippopotamus bones found in Israel, and I don't know where they were found exactly, so that might give us a clue. So that was the first question. And your second one was about the sort of vegetarian in Genesis 1. And of course, you know that as actually when you get to Genesis 9, verse 2, I think it is, after the flood, God then allows the eating of meat, almost as a concession, actually, to the post-flood humans. But he lays very strict boundaries around it about the shedding of blood. And of course, out of that comes the Jewish the food laws, but the shedding of the blood is regarded as something that is not still allowed. I wrestle with that verse, that verses as a vegetarian actually, because I don't want to put anybody on the spot. There's a bit of me that thinks, is vegetarian the best, and meat eating a sort of, just, sorry, I'm going to be controversial here. Is it a bit like Jesus said, about Moses and divorce for the hardness of your hearts, or something like that? Is it something that actually we're supposed to embrace, or we're supposed to be cautious about? I don't know. I'm going to just throw that out as a provocative question for you to go away and think about.
At that point, I'm a carnivore. So.
Yeah, I know you are. You're going to take me to task afterwards and give me a few pointers, are you?
Well, on that point, I think we'll finish, and thank you, Hilary, for bringing this text to light to us. Thank you.